and welcome to my YouTube channel, Living in Chicagoland Suburbs, or the suburbs of Chicagoland. Today's topic is going to be buyer's agreements. As of August 17th, the National Association of Realtors is requiring that all purchases of real estate property, when represented by a buyer's agent, a real estate agent, if the buyer is indeed represented by one of those people, they must have a signed agreement that addresses the issue of how the buyer's agent will be compensated. And the basic of that is the buyer will agree to be responsible for the payment of whatever they have negotiated as the buyer's agent's compensation. Let's say, for the sake of argument, we will say that that compensation will be 3% of the sale price of the property that the buyer is purchasing. Now, so the key here is that the buyer will be responsible for that 3%. It doesn't say necessarily that the buyer will be paying it, although that may be an option that enters into the proposition. So, unlike the past, where the seller was responsible for paying their listing agency, they were also agreeing that they would pay the buyer's agent as well through the brokerage, through the listing brokerage. In other words, they have agreed to pay a percentage that covers both the seller's listing agreement price tag and the buyer's expectation in a cooperative compensation. Now, all that seller is agreeing to in their listing agreement is they are absolutely agreeing to the compensation of their own listing agent's brokerage. Okay. In my particular cases, in the listings that I'm having, I'm encouraging my sellers to agree to pay the buyer's compensation as well, the buyer's agent's compensation, at least the lion's share of it, or all of it, or a substantial amount. The reason for that is to keep things cleaner and easier to negotiate, because when the buyer comes to my sellers with a contract is not only negotiating the sale price or the closing date, or whether this is a cash deal or it's a mortgage purchase or whatever. In addition, now there is going to be an addendum to that contract, which states how the buyer is expecting his agent's brokerage to be paid. Okay. And typically what's going to occur here is that the buyer is going to add a compensation addendum to the contract that he or she is making. So they're going to negotiate all the standard things, the price and the closing date, etc. But now they are also coming to you, the seller, and saying, we want you to pay X dollars, or whatever the percentage may be, that buyer has agreed to be responsible for. He is now asking the seller to pay that. They can pay it directly, they can pay it through their listing brokerage, whatever the case may be, but the buyer is going to make a statement of exactly what they expect the seller to pay. Now, that becomes a negotiable item, which is exactly what the National Association of Realtors is wanting to achieve here. They want transparency, and they want these commission compensations to be negotiated items. And so that is essentially how it's going to happen. There's a variety of ways it can take place. For example, if a buyer sends that compensation or that contract, you can also send a compensation statement. And in it, it's got several check marks. There are 4 of them here for how that buyer expects the seller to compensate his agent and the agent's brokerage. There's a check mark. You can make a check mark. The funds will be coming from the buyer in the amount of. So the buyer may say, I'm going to pay the whole schmott. Okay. The funds will be coming from the seller in the amount of whatever the compensation may be. And this can be, if it says it's coming from the seller directly, that means that the seller is coming to the closing table with a certified check for the funds required in that, whatever the negotiated compensation was. The third check mark is the funds will be coming from the seller's broker in the amount of, and we assume it's the percentage. Now, in that case, what the seller is agreeing to is he's going to compensate his brokerage, his listing brokerage, the amount of money that he expects to pay them for their services in selling his property. And now the seller is going to include the compensation for the buyer's agent and their agency. So if the agreed upon commission will be 3% to the buyer's agency, and the seller has already agreed to 3% to his listing brokerage, he's going to now say, okay, you guys take 6% out of the closing funds and pay them 3% and pay yourselves 3%. If it goes from brokerage to brokerage. There's a fourth check mark here that the funds come from others in the amount of blah, blah, and it says, please describe. It can be there's a closing cost credit, or there's a gift from the mother-in-law or the father-in-law in the amount of whatever that percentage might be. You can further negotiate this by saying, the buyer is requesting 3% from the seller's funds to pay his agent for the services that they provided. And the seller may have already agreed in his listing agreement with their listing brokerage that he or she is prepared to pay 2.5% in a compensation to the co-op. And so he may respond or she may respond by saying, you know what, we've already agreed to pay 2.5%, and I'm not going to pay 3%. If you want to purchase the property, then you'll have to find that extra 0.5% somewhere else, either in your pocketbook or your brokerage agrees to reduce their compensation, whatever the case may be. I don't care how you find it, but I'm paying 2.5%, not 3%. So then that becomes a negotiable item, and the seller says, well, what are we going to do here? You know what? I like the house. I want blah, blah, blah. Pick up that extra 0.5%. So the buyer will come to the closing table with a check for 0.5% of the sale price. And then the seller will be responsible for the other 2.5%, which he or she had already agreed to in their listing agreement. So that's in essence what we're talking about. The buyer will sign an agreement to be responsible for his agent receiving a compensation for his services and her services that have been provided to the buyer in finding that property. And those, by the way, those are pretty extensive. It's not, okay, match of the house, that's fine. Meet you at the closing table. It gets a little bit more complicated than that. There's dealing with appraisers. There's dealing with home inspections. There's dealing with surveyors. There's dealing with lenders. The list goes on and on. And so they earn whatever the may be that they have agreed to accept with their buyer. So essentially all that's happening that's different is that now how the buyer's agent gets compensated is a negotiable item, okay, between the buyer and the seller, essentially. And that has not necessarily been the case in the past. Typically, that negotiation took place between the seller and his broker. So there you have it, the long and the short of it, as they say. Hope this wasn't hopelessly confusing to you. If it was, give me a call, 847-651-2582. Dennis Cecil. Dennis Cecil with Baird and Warner Real Estate. If you found this interesting and maybe somewhat informative, and you'd like to know more about the real estate business in Chicagoland, why please hit the subscribe button on your screen, and we'll be sure to let you know exactly when the next video is coming your way. We try to get 1 or 2 videos out each week, all dealing with topics of importance in the real estate world, and sometimes even just how it is to live in Chicagoland. You can check out some of my previous videos on places to dine, entertainments, etc., entertainment venues in the Chicagoland suburb. You might find a lot of them interesting. So if you're looking forward to the meeting with us again, why hit the subscribe button. If you've got a burning question and you just got to know the answer to, why give me a call, 847-651-2582. Typically, you'll wind up in voicemail, but I do respond to those as quickly as I see them on my screen. God bless, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of your day. Why not? Take care. Bye-bye.